Good evening, APUSH Nation, and welcome in for our second edition of this year's Fireside Chats. It is a Monday evening here in the Smith household, but you'll be seeing this on Tuesday. And if you're wondering why I'm in a particularly chipper mood tonight, it has to do with a couple of things. First of all, my beloved New York Mets smacked a team record 8 home runs tonight in a 16-7 win. So that's got me feeling pretty good. Plus, tonight for dinner, I had the best chicken wings in all of Gilbert and Chandler at a little place called Copper Still. I highly recommend it. It's a great place to hang out and get some good food. But that being said, let's transition into tonight's topic, which is truly the quintessential example in our colonial studies, which is about the Puritan effect in New England colonies, and that's the Salem Witch Trials. Now, you may have had a little bit of background on this along the way somewhere, perhaps in a previous history class or even perhaps an English class. And I'll get to that connection here momentarily. But when we talked about beginning in class on Monday and then especially today, what Puritanism was in the colonies and how in particular in New England, the Massachusetts Bay Colony especially, as the colony grew, and so too did the Puritan lifestyle, and it infected everyone living in that region, and it greatly altered the course of actions and the course of lifestyle and the course of ideology, in particular Mass Bay, much greater than it did anywhere else. And you got to bear in mind what we talked about today in class. Puritanism was a rigid structure socially, it was a rigid structure politically, and it was a rigid structure religiously. And it drove people away. That's what we got into the conversation today about Anne Hutchinson being expelled. And we talked about Roger Williams moving on to form the colony of Rhode Island. And of course, we even mentioned Thomas Hooker, who went on to form the colony of Connecticut, all as a result of not being able to coexist with the rigid authority that was breaking down society in Mass Bay. And again, the term I just want to remind you of, at this stage in American history, Mass Bay in particular had really become a theocracy where the church was the head of everything in society. It ran the government, it ran the people, it operated the court system. The church was everything. So Mass Bay was a true theocracy. Now, in terms of progressing in timeline here, we should have today, or tomorrow I should say, in class, I'm speaking about what I'm going to be planning on doing with you guys ahead of time. But anyways, we're going to be looking at, or we have already looked at, I should say, some of the native conflicts and some of the other influencing factors that were driving life in particular New England. But I want to just remind you that Salem was, in terms of geography, a very well-established colonial outpost. I wouldn't call it a city, but it was definitely a little bit larger than a village. And it was on the very fringes of the Mass Bay colony. So it was not close in proximity necessarily to Boston. It was not a major hub of trade near the water. It was on the very outskirts of Massachusetts Bay. Very similar to how in the Bacon's Rebellion we talked about those frontier planters were living on the fringes of society in Virginia. So Salem was a society of Puritans living on the very fringes. So that gave it an even more heightened sense of authoritative outlook, in the sense that the Puritans who governed Salem were not necessarily mixing it up with as many foreigners or as many natives or certainly as many well-established people in the Boston community. So keeping that in mind, that really answers a lot of questions as to why an event like the Salem Witch Trials could take place. And if you don't know anything about the Salem Witch Trials, I want to clear up one thing. Witchcraft and executing people on claims of witchcraft is nothing new. The Puritans didn't invent that. That had been going on since the Middle Ages, especially during the Great Plague era in European history, where hundreds of people, thousands of people were killed under their beliefs of witchcraft. But there's always been this sort of obsession, especially in Christian faiths, with the idea that the devil can inhabit people and take over their bodies and possess them to do evil things. And for the Puritans, remember, their fanatical almost beliefs in Christianity led them to govern and to live a lifestyle that was extremely rigid. They did not bend at all in their beliefs. And so as the colonies began to grow, and especially New England began to grow, and new ones were being formed, here you have Salem, who's on the very edge of Mass Bay, this growing now trade colony, and people were nervous. There was a sense of tension. Fear of death was around every corner, it seemed, whether it was diseases, starvation, exposure, native attacks. And so that heightened fear really drove a lot of people in Salem in particular, but also elsewhere in the colonies, not just Salem, but elsewhere in the colonies, this idea that your power was going to run out, that eventually the world was going to consume and evil was going to take over the world and run it into the ground. So in 1692, Salem begins to become the epicenter of a number of accusations that witchcraft has become pervasive within the village. And essentially, who would be considered witches? You're looking at young women and even older women who tended to be those who were accused. And this really drives a very important point to mention that's sort of a tangential issue, that it wasn't just about fear of the devil or fear of losing power that motivated the government within Salem to eventually put 19 people to death. 19 people were killed, executed by the state for alleged crimes of witchcraft. Ultimately, the Salem Witch Trials perhaps is most about the relationship between men and women in these colonial societies. Women were viewed as inferior to men, both morally, physically, spiritually. We talked about what happened to Anne Hutchinson. As soon as Anne Hutchinson attempted to speak out and practice and preach her beliefs outside the Puritan church, she was excommunicated and exiled out of Mass Bay. So this fear of women was really a heightened aspect that often gets overlooked in terms of the Salem Witch Trials. Because after all, women were the ones who were accused of being witches. Women were the ones accusing each other of witches, and that usually was the younger women turning on the older women in society, for whatever reasons those may have been. And so it really represents in Puritan lifestyle a great social inequality, in that the men, who of course controlled the church, who ran the government, were the only ones that could have any say whatsoever in voting within the colony, the men viewed the rise of women, the individuality, the fact that certain women were acting differently and practicing their faith and experiencing psychologically and physically bizarre occurrences. This was viewed as a complete threat to the gender balance within Salem. And it's one of the very most profound reasons, again, along a fear of evil, the religious fear, and political fear as well. You're losing political power as a result of the colonies growing further and further, and people are becoming less and less aware, and maybe the church is even becoming less important within the colony, and it's the perfect recipe for the slaughter, not blood slaughter, but the hanging, I should say, of 19 people over the course of a 1-year period. So the witch trials were not just one event. They lasted for almost a year, and people were eventually killed. 19 people sentenced to die by the Plymouth, I'm sorry, that's bad, not by the Plymouth, the Salem government. Now, to bring you guys in on a little bit more about the overall context and why it matters for you, I'm going to turn things over to one of the former APUSH Nation heroes of last year, and one of the students who was helping me out this year. And they'll be appearing frequently in these videos. And I'm going to turn it over to her to talk to you a little bit more about the context of the Salem Witch Trials.
Hey guys, it's Vanessa. So the Salem Witch Trials had 3 main effects. 1, it caused people to adopt a more secular way of thinking. 2, it threatened Puritan leadership. And 3, it initiated a divide between church and state. So prior to all the hysteria that happened, New England colony was dominated by Puritan leadership and Puritan ideals. But these ideals meant that you would have to follow a strict moral code. And when the New Englanders began to see all the chaos that was happening with the accusations and all the witchcraft, they began to doubt not only Puritan rules, but the church itself. and they traded their Puritan beliefs for a more secular way of thinking. So what happens when people start to turn away from the church? Well, the church's leadership role diminishes and their influence over society lessens. But I should put in the disclaimer that the church still plays a role in society. Just because some people stopped following the church, there were still some who were avid supporters of the Puritan church and who still followed Puritan ideals. But the main takeaway is that religion has a less significant role in New England society. And as a result, there becomes a divide between the church and the state. So just as a recap, everything kind of happens in a domino effect. People adopt a more secular way of thinking. This threatens the church, which ultimately leads to a divide between church and state. So thanks for listening. Back to Mr. Smith.
Thanks, Vanessa. You did a great job, and it's obvious that last year you were paying attention when we did this thing. So I appreciate your help tonight, and you'll be back much later and throughout the year for us. So there you have it. You heard it from one of the best of the APUSH Nation members last year. Salem Witch Trials, a pivotal turning point in terms of Puritanism in the colonies, and we'll see as we hit the 1700s where Puritanism takes shape and how things will turn out, especially in the development of the New England colonies as we keep rocking and rolling. Just a reminder that on that reading quiz tomorrow, some of you guys took a few licks. Again, I'm not nitpicking through the book. I'm looking for main ideas, big terms, and anything we've talked about in class, anything in the Fireside chat, and then certainly everything from that reading you guys did in the textbook is fair game, along with the Ann Hutchinson stuff that we did in class today. So good luck to you guys as you prepare for our second quiz of the year. And with that being said, I just want to remind you, the past shapes the future. Have a good night.